Edward Carter, a wealthy and accomplished man, agreed to marry someone completely unlike his typical choice for a mere wager. Yet, through this experience, he discovered something that profoundly changed him. In his luxurious penthouse, towering over the bright lights of Manhattan, Edward Carter held a delicate whiskey glass. From this height, the world below appeared minute and unimportant, a reflection of how he perceived most people. At 43, Edward was a self-made billionaire, leading Carter Enterprises and dominating the financial world. He had all he could dream of: immense wealth, power, and influence. But beneath his expertly crafted image and elegant suits was a deep-seated arrogance, the result of many years of unbroken success. His elite circle of friends shared his personality traits: self-satisfied, elitist, and entirely removed from the everyday struggles of life. That evening, Edward hosted one of his renowned cocktail parties, attended by the city's most influential and affluent figures. Expensive champagne flowed abundantly, laughter echoed throughout the elegant space, and the conversations were about investment deals, lavish trips, and occasionally, ridiculing those outside their exclusive circle. Moving effortlessly through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, and basking in admiration, Edward was intercepted by his friend and sometime rival, Marcus Whitman, at the Marble Bar. "Still the same Edward," Marcus remarked with a sly grin, swirling his wine. "Always the man, living the perfect life." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Would you expect anything else?" Marcus chuckled. "Not quite. But tell me, do you ever grow weary of it? The same parties, the same faces, the same everything." Edward took another sip of whiskey and leaned against the bar. "Weary? Certainly not. Why alter a winning formula?" Marcus's smile widened, a glint of intrigue in his eyes. "You're far too predictable, Edward. While you've built an empire, you've also erected such high walls that nothing surprises you anymore. Don't you ever long for a true challenge?" Edward tilted his head, both intrigued and cautious. "What kind of challenge?" Marcus leaned closer, whispering conspiratorially. "A genuine challenge. Something outside your circle of control. Something, or someone, you can't purchase, manipulate, or dominate." Edward laughed sharply, full of confidence. "There's no such thing?" "Oh, but there is," Marcus insisted. "I'll wager on it." The word wager snagged Edward's attention like a lure. His competitive nature was known to all, and Marcus played right into it. Edward regarded life as a series of calculated victories, each reinforcing his belief that any obstacle could be overcome. "What's the wager?" Edward asked, sounding casual, yet clearly interested. Marcus gestured toward the room, where guests in designer finery sipped vintage wine. "We both know your type, Edward. Young, beautiful, refined women who match this world of yours. But what if I challenged you to marry someone completely opposite?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "Define opposite." Marcus grinned. "Someone who doesn't fit your mold. Someone who isn't your idea of conventional beauty, hailing from a different world. And here's the stipulation. You must remain married for 6 months. No loopholes, no tricks." Edward set down his glass, his mind racing. He saw the proposition as a game, one more chance to prove his dominance. The absurdity of the terms only made it more appealing. "And what's in it for me?" Edward inquired. Marcus leaned even closer, lowering his voice. "If you succeed, I'll invest $50 million into Carter Enterprises. No conditions, but if you fail, say goodbye to your reputation as the unbeatable Edward Carter." Edward smirked, full of unshakable confidence. "You're on." Their conversation moved on, but the bet lingered in Edward's thoughts. He prided himself on winning every contest, and this one, although unconventional, would be no different. He was determined to find someone, marry her, and prove that whatever the circumstances, Edward Carter always came out ahead. Over the next week, Edward set his staff to work. His trusted assistant, Samantha, discreetly compiled a list of potential women, those far removed from Edward's world, yet in line with Marcus's criteria. Edward reviewed the profiles with detached interest, treating each name and face as if sealing another business deal. Then he found her, Amara James. She instantly caught his eye, not because she fit his preferences, but because she defied them. A 36-year-old social worker with a full, curvaceous figure, Amara ran a nonprofit aiding underserved communities. She had no links to high society, no affinity for luxury, and was known for her firm resolve. Edward smirked. The challenge was underway. Edward's lips curled into a sly grin. She would suffice. He scheduled a meeting under the pretense of discussing a possible collaboration with her nonprofit. When Amara stepped into his office, Edward was captivated by her aura. She exuded a calm assurance, her natural curls accentuating a face that was both welcoming and firm. Her attire was simple, yet professional, significantly different from the polished image of the women Edward was accustomed to. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, extending her hand. "I appreciate your outreach. It's not every day someone of your status shows interest in our efforts." Her words, though courteous, held a subtle air of challenge. Edward smiled, concealing his own curiosity. "Miss James, I'm committed to supporting meaningful initiatives. Your work resonated with me." The meeting progressed with Amara detailing her nonprofit's mission and the obstacles they faced in obtaining financial support. Edward listened, feigning interest while plotting how to best present his offer. As the conversation evolved, Edward leaned in, his voice carrying a quiet command. "Amara, I have a proposal for you, one that could bring your organization the resources it desperately requires." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her skepticism apparent. "What kind of proposal?" Edward's smile widened. "Marry me." The room fell into silence. Edward carefully laid out the terms, sidestepping the true motive behind the offer. He portrayed the marriage as a mutually advantageous agreement. She would receive the funding and exposure her nonprofit needed, and he claimed it would boost his public image. Amara's expression remained unreadable as she absorbed his words. Edward knew she was contemplating her options. She was shrewd and prudent, traits he found both vexing and fascinating. "I'll need time to consider it," she finally responded. Edward nodded, confident he had sown the seed. People always came around when the stakes were sufficiently high. As Amara exited his office, Edward felt a wave of satisfaction. Everything was aligning perfectly, and soon, the game he was so eager to begin would unfold. Little did he realize, the challenge he had so boldly embraced would unthread his meticulously woven world in unimaginable ways. Amara James sat at the small wooden desk in her modest office, surrounded by heaps of papers, budget sheets, and community grant applications. The flickering, fluorescent lights above her cast a dim glow as she reviewed yet another rejection letter from a potential donor. Frustration gnawed at her, but she steeled herself against it. For a decade now, she had invested her heart and soul into her nonprofit organization, Rise Up, providing housing, education, and career opportunities for underserved communities. Despite the trials, she believed wholeheartedly in her mission, even when funding was meager. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. The message was from Edward Carter's assistant, Samantha, confirming a follow-up meeting. Amara gazed at the screen, her brow furrowing in thought. The initial meeting with Edward had been a surprise. Wealthy individuals like him seldom showed interest in grassroots organizations like hers. He was polished, confident, and, if she were to admit, intimidating. Yet, there was something in his offer, a mix of boldness and intrigue that lingered in her mind. When Amara arrived at Edward's sleek corporate office the following day, she felt out of place. The towering glass walls of the building and its cold, immaculate interior starkly contrasted with the vibrant yet humble community center where she spent most of her time. Nevertheless, she walked in with her head held high, resolute not to let her surroundings erode her confidence. Edward greeted her with the same polished charm he had displayed during their initial encounter. he gestured for her to sit in one of the lavish leather chairs in front of his desk, his expression inscrutable. "Miss James?" Edward began smoothly. "I appreciate your return. Have you given my proposal some thought?" Amara stood with arms crossed and unwavering gaze. "I've considered it, but I still can't wrap my head around why someone like you would propose something so non-traditional. A marriage proposal wasn't what I anticipated when you mentioned wanting to assist." Edward leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. "Let's be straightforward, Amara. Individuals with wealth and influence, like myself, are often under scrutiny. Partnerships like this can be advantageous for both sides. You need financial backing for your organization, and I need to demonstrate commitment to meaningful causes." Amara tilted her head slightly. "So you're after a PR tactic?" "Not merely that," Edward replied, a touch of amusement in his voice. "I believe in mutually beneficial arrangements. This is a business deal, Miss James. Nothing beyond that." The term business weighed heavily between them. For Amara, her work was intensely personal, tied to her identity and childhood struggles. For Edward, it all appeared transactional, a game of leverage and control. Still, she couldn't deny that his support could revolutionize her nonprofit. The notion of a fake marriage left her uneasy, but she knew what was at stake for those she cared for. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "If I agree, I have conditions. My independence is non-negotiable. I'll continue my work my way, without interference. Every penny you provide goes straight to the community." Edward's grin widened, eyes gleaming with triumph. "Deal." "And another thing," Amara added, leaning in. "If I find this arrangement undermines my values, I'll leave. No amount of money will keep me here." Edward's confidence remained unshaken. "I understand." With hesitation, Amara extended her hand, and Edward shook it firmly, sealing their agreement. As she left his office, a mix of doubt and determination muddled her thoughts. She had made a choice that could transform the lives of those she tirelessly worked for. But it came with a personal price. The wedding was swiftly arranged, understated yet elegant. Edward ensured the ceremony was refined, despite its modest size. Amara arrived in a simple ivory dress, having declined the stylist and designer Edward's assistant suggested. She felt out of place in the immaculate chapel, surrounded by Edward's sophisticated acquaintances and a few distant relatives. Her friends' and family's absence was intentional. She couldn't face explaining the situation to them. As the officiant declared them husband and wife, Amara noticed Edward's expression. He seemed content, as if he'd just secured a lucrative contract. Her stomach churned at the thought. The reception was equally detached. Edward mingled with the guests, exchanging pleasantries, while Amara quietly observed from a corner table, feeling like a mere pawn in Edward's elaborate game of chess. Despite her discomfort, she reminded herself of the reason she agreed: funding for Rise Up. She wouldn't let her pride hinder help for those relying on her. Their first night as a married couple set the tone for their arrangement. Edward escorted Amara to the penthouse, a vast space adorned with modern art and expansive windows, showcasing Manhattan's skyline. It was worlds apart from the cozy apartment she called home. "This is your home now," Edward stated formally. "I hope it's comfortable for you." Amara surveyed the area with a neutral expression. "It's impressive." Edward smirked. "You'll come to feel at home here." Yet, Amara intended not to get accustomed. She unpacked in the guest room, an unmistakable sign to Edward she planned to share nothing but the title of wife. He raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, retreating to his room without further comment. In the subsequent weeks, their dynamic took form. True to his word, Edward transferred significant funds to Rise Up, enabling Amara to expand her programs and staff. Still, despite the material gains, tensions simmered. Edward, used to the spotlight, found Amara's indifference both confounding and infuriating. She declined his invitations to high society events, focusing on her work instead. Amara, for her part, steadfastly maintained her boundaries. She saw through Edward's efforts to impress her with costly gifts and lavish gestures. When he presented her with a diamond necklace, she gracefully refused, saying, "I'd prefer that money. Build a new community center." Edward's frustration grew, but was masked by his air of certainty. He believed he could eventually wear down her resolve, that she would align with his world. But he hadn't realized Amara wasn't playing by his rules. Her strength and unwavering self-identity presented a challenge he hadn't anticipated. As days turned into weeks, cracks in Edward's carefully maintained facade began to emerge. For the first time, he encountered someone he couldn't control. And this both intrigued and unsettled him. What began as a strategy started feeling far more complex than anticipated. The sleek black car cruised into the heart of the city's most neglected neighborhood. Edward Carter sat in the back, observing the decaying buildings, faded graffiti on brick walls, and bustling streets with children playing and people chatting. The scenes seemed alien, like a documentary he'd typically ignore after mere minutes. Amara had insisted that Edward join her at a Rise Up community event. For her, it was a chance to showcase the work that defined her. For Edward, it was a duty, another box to check off to maintain their arrangement's illusion. The car halted by a renovated warehouse. Once desolate, it now bustled as a community center, its vibrant murals standing out against the gray monotony. Amara was already there, dressed in jeans and a Rise Up t-shirt, directing volunteers with calm efficiency. She had an aura that drew others in. Despite his hesitance, Edward watched her with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Exiting the car, he immediately felt out of place. His tailored suit and fine shoes practically screamed, "I don't belong here." Heads turned as he approached, some curious, others openly hostile. The discomfort in his chest grew, but he stood taller, refusing to show it. Amara greeted him with a curt nod. "Glad you could make it," she said, her tone professional yet distant. "We'll start with the food pantry." She led him inside, past rows of tables laden with donated goods, canned items, fresh produce, and bags of rice. Volunteers efficiently distributed supplies to families, many looking tired, yet thankful. Amara explained as they walked, her voice firm and pragmatic. "This is a key program," she noted. "We feed over 200 families weekly. Many face unemployment, low wages, or medical debt. Without this, some couldn't eat." Edward nodded politely, yet he couldn't ignore the disparity, the lavish expenditures by his company against a single meal's significance here. For the first time, he felt the weight of his decisions begin to settle in. His business handled millions every day, so the thought of supporting 200 families felt insignificant to him. He almost vocalized this, but stopped, realizing how out of touch it would sound in such a setting. They proceeded to the tutoring section for after-school activities, where kids were engaged with volunteer teachers at small tables. The walls, adorned with vibrant drawings and posters, stood in stark contrast to the reality outside these walls. Amara crouched next to a table, assisting a boy grappling with a math problem. From afar, Edward felt like an outsider peering into a world beyond his understanding. "Why do you do this?" he asked when Amara returned to his side. "I mean, you devote so much to this work. But why?" Her gaze was indecipherable. "Because someone must," she answered simply. "I know how it feels to be invisible, to struggle and question if anyone cares, and I can't bear to sit by idly when I know I can make a difference." Edward remained quiet, her words disturbing him. Not because he disagreed, but because they forced him to face a reality he had long ignored. He had never really cared about anyone beyond his small, carefully selected world. His life was centered around profits and influence, and the notion of committing himself to something altruistic was as alien to him as this neighborhood. The day went on, with Amara guiding Edward through each part of the center. He encountered single mothers striving to rebuild their lives, teenagers dreaming of brighter futures, and elderly residents who found solace in this safe space. Every interaction eroded his self-assurance, leaving him uneasy. He was accustomed to being the most influential person around, the one everyone looked up to. But here, his wealth and status were meaningless. When they returned to the car, Edward was unusually silent. Amara didn't urge him to share his thoughts, and the silence hung heavily between them. As the car departed, Edward gazed out the window, his mind in turmoil. For the first time in years, he felt unsure about himself, his choices, and the world beyond his sheltered life. Back in his penthouse that evening, Edward poured a drink and sat by the vast windows overlooking the city's dazzling skyline. Usually, the view filled him with pride and achievement. Tonight, it felt empty. The faces from the day haunted him. The exhausted mother balancing a toddler, the elderly man whose hands quivered as he accepted a food box, the teenage girl aspiring to become a doctor. These were people he would have previously overlooked without a second thought. Now he couldn't rid himself of the sense that he had overlooked something significant, something genuine. Amara returned an hour later, carrying a box of leftover donations. She walked past him into the kitchen without acknowledging him and began unloading the items. He observed her from the living room, uncertain of what to say. Finally, he set down his glass and found his voice. Today was different. Amara glanced over, her eyebrow raised. "Is that your way of saying uncomfortable?" Edward hesitated. "Perhaps. It's not the kind of place I'm accustomed to." "It shows," she replied, her voice sharp yet not unkind. "But that's the crux of the issue. You've spent your life in a bubble, Edward. You don't know what it's like to struggle, to worry about rent or feeding your family." Her words pierced him, even though he couldn't deny their truth. He wanted to defend himself, to mention his success and the sacrifices made to achieve it. But something held him back. Instead, he found himself nodding, to his own surprise. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't understand, but I want to." Amara regarded him for a long moment, her expression slightly softening. "We'll see," she replied, returning to her task. "Actions speak louder than words." Edward kept quiet, her words resonating within him. He had always taken pride in his knack for triumph, tackling any obstacle with ease. But this wasn't just another conquest, and for the first time, he questioned if victory was the true aim. As night deepened, Edward's focus shifted from the wager to the woman who had unexpectedly shaken his world. Amara was unlike anyone he had encountered, resilient, unwavering, and deeply caring. She challenged him in ways he hadn't realized he needed, and although he wouldn't confess, there was a part of him that yearned to meet that challenge. For the first time in his life, Edward Carter felt unsure of his identity, and that uncertainty terrified him. Edward Carter had always considered control to be his greatest asset. Each decision he made was intricately planned to ensure he maintained authority over his life and those around him. But Amara James seemed immune to his sway, and her steadfast independence tested his patience to its limits. The incidents at the community center left him feeling uneasy, and rather than reflecting on his discomfort, he resorted to his usual response to insecurity. He attempted to exert control. The morning after their visit to Rise Up, Edward entered the kitchen, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his confidence seemingly back in place. Amara was already there, sipping coffee and engrossed in a report on her laptop. She didn't glance up when he walked in, her attention fixed on her work. "You know," Edward started, pouring himself some coffee, "if you spent less time buried in those documents and more time at events with me, you might actually find some enjoyment." Amara briefly lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Enjoy myself? At one of your ritzy galas, where people pretend to care about causes they don't comprehend? No thanks." Edward's jaw clenched. "Those galas raise millions. They're effective." "For the organizers, maybe," Amara responded, setting her cup down. "But they rarely make a real difference to those who truly need it. True change doesn't stem from fancy dinners and empty speeches." Her words hit a sore spot. Edward had built his empire on the belief that appearances were of greater importance than substance. He took pride in his ability to charm and influence, yet she saw right through it all. Rather than continuing the debate, he tried a different approach. "I've got a charity event tonight. he said, maintaining a casual tone. "It would mean a lot if you came along." Amara's face remained unchanged. "And by mean a lot, you mean it would be good for your image?" Edward smirked, though her remark struck a nerve. "Call it what you will, it's still a great chance for you to make connections. I'm not interested in mingling with people who don't comprehend what I do," Amara said assertively. "But thank you for the offer." Her refusal left Edward simmering in frustration. He had believed that his wealth and influence would eventually win her over. But Amara was proving to be far more challenging than he'd expected. That evening, Edward attended the gala alone. The event was hosted in a sparkling ballroom filled with Manhattan's elite, each one dressed to impress. The conversations revolved around investment ventures, art bids, and charity donations serving as tax deductions. Edward navigated the room with ease, meeting people and exchanging pleasantries. But his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Amara. Her incisive comments, her quiet strength, the way she dismissed everything he held dear. For the first time in years, a nagging doubt crept in. Could she be right? Were all his philanthropic efforts merely superficial acts? The thought disturbed him, and he tried to drown it with another glass of champagne. The following day, Edward decided to become more assertive. If Amara wouldn't integrate into his world, he would find a way to bring it to hers. He began arranging events and meetings that demanded her attendance, presenting them as vital for the public face of Rise Up. Amara reluctantly attended a few of Edward's gatherings, but she soon grew tired of the shallow. At one such gathering, a luncheon held by one of Edward's business associates, Amara found herself sitting between two women more interested in gossip than in meaningful dialogue. One woman leaned closer, her diamond earrings glinting in the light. "So, Amara," she said with an overly sweet smile, "how did you and Edward come to meet? It must have been a rather whirlwind romance." Amara managed a polite smile. "We met through mutual friends." "Ah, I see," the woman replied, clearly fishing for more information. "And what is it that you do again?" "I run a non-profit organization," Amara replied, her tone calm and determined. "We work on providing resources and support to underserved communities." The woman's smile diminished, her interest fading almost immediately. "How noble," she said dismissively, turning her attention to the woman sitting on her other side. Amara swallowed a retort, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. She glanced at Edward, who was engrossed in conversation with another guest, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. Later, as they rode home in silence, Amara finally spoke up. "This isn't working," she said. Edward looked at her, his expression inscrutable. "What isn't?" "This," she gestured between them. "You dragging me to events where no one cares about what I do or who I am. It's a waste of time for us both." Edward frowned. "Those events could help build connections. You might secure funding for your projects if you played your cards right." Amara shook her head. "You still don't understand, do you? I'm not interested in playing games or catering to people who only care about appearances. My work is about real people, real issues, not impressing your friends." Her words struck a nerve with Edward, but instead of admitting her point, he stood firm. "Sometimes you have to compromise, Amara. That's how things work." "Perhaps in your world," she retorted. "But I'm not like you, Edward. I don't compromise my values for convenience." The car lapsed into silence once more, the tension between them thick and relentless. In the following weeks, their arguments intensified. Edward's attempts to control Amara became more transparent, and her resistance only strengthened. He began questioning her choices, subtly undermining her authority at Rise Up by suggesting alternative uses for the resources he provided. Amara stood firm, determined not to let him dictate her work. One evening, their argument reached a boiling point. "You think you're so righteous," Edward snapped. "But the reality is, without my money, your precious non-profit wouldn't survive." Amara's eyes narrowed, her voice calm and resolute. "You're right. Your financial support has helped. But don't think for a moment that it gives you the right to control me or my work. I built this organization from the ground up without your help, and I'll continue fighting for it, with or without you." Her words struck Edward harder than he anticipated. In that moment, he saw her not as a challenge to conquer, but as someone who had braved far more than he ever had himself. This realization was unsettling, leaving him uncertain how to react. He turned away instead, retreating to his study. As he poured himself another drink, he couldn't shake the persistent feeling that he was losing, not just his wager, but something far more important. For the first time in his life, Edward Carter was facing a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The following days after their explosive argument were filled with tense silence. Amara immersed herself completely in her work at Rise Up, steering clear of Edward whenever she could. She spent long hours at the community center, channeling her frustration into helping others. Meanwhile, Edward withdrew to his office, immersing himself in business deals and financial reports. Both were too stubborn to acknowledge the growing rift between them. But the tension was undeniable. Edward couldn't stop replaying their last conversation in his mind. Amara's words lingered in Edward's thoughts. "Created this organization from scratch without your assistance, and I'll continue fighting for it, whether you're with me or not." Her courage and refusal to be intimidated by him were maddening. Yet, they sparked something deeper inside him. For years, his company had been filled with individuals who complied with his demands, but Amara stood firm and refused to bow, making her impossible to overlook. One night, Edward found himself browsing Rise Up's social media account. He hadn't paid much attention to the group before, but now, curiosity urged him to find out more. He watched clips of Amara speaking at events, her voice steady and fervent as she championed the people she worked for. He read testimonials from those whose lives had changed because of her efforts. A single mother who secured stable housing, a young man awarded a scholarship due to the center's mentoring, an elderly woman who no longer felt invisible. These tales were humbling, and Edward couldn't escape the feeling of inadequacy they sparked within him. For the first time, he began to doubt the worth of his own accomplishments. His billions had brought him influence and recognition. But what real impact had he made? The next morning, Edward reached a conclusion. Rather than waiting for Amara to return to the penthouse late at night, he chose to meet her in her own environment. He arrived at the community center unannounced, stepping into the lively building with its worn paint and mismatched decor. The atmosphere buzzed with energy as volunteers organized donations, children played in the corner, and a group of seniors planned their community garden. Edward felt like an outsider, but he set the discomfort aside. He saw Amara across the room, conversing with a young woman who seemed barely 20. The girl, holding a sleeping toddler, looked both worn out and relieved as Amara handed her a flyer and a packet of diapers. Then Amara turned and froze upon seeing Edward there. Her face was unreadable, but her tone was curt when she approached him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, arms crossed. "I wanted to witness this for myself," Edward replied plainly. "I wanted to understand what you do." Amara raised an eyebrow. "And why the sudden interest? Trying to prove something?" Edward paused, then shook his head. I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things. I came to learn." Her doubt was clear, but she didn't brush him off. Instead, she handed him a clipboard. "If you're truly interested, start by helping. We're sorting supplies for the food pantry." Edward accepted the clipboard and followed her guidance. For the next several hours, he worked alongside the volunteers, arranging boxes of canned goods and packing bags for families in need. It was monotonous, repetitive work, but it opened his eyes to a new perspective. He listened as the volunteers shared their experiences, their challenges, their dreams for the future. Many were former beneficiaries of Rise Up's programs and were now giving back. Amara watched Edward closely, noting how out of his element he appeared. Yet, to her surprise, he neither complained nor tried to exert authority. He worked quietly, listening more than he spoke. By the day's end, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, and his polished facade slipped away. He appeared, for once, like an ordinary man striving to make a difference. That evening, as they wrapped up at the center, Edward approached Amara. She was tidying a table of pamphlets, her weariness evident but her resolve steady. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. Amara looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For allowing me to see this," Edward said. "For giving me the opportunity to understand." Her expression softened, but she didn't fully let down her guard. "Understanding is one thing, Edward," she replied. "But this isn't a one-time event. These individuals deserve consistency, not just empty promises." "I understand," Edward replied, looking directly at her. "I want to contribute, not only with my money, but with my time and connections. Whatever I can do to support your efforts." Amara examined him closely, searching for any signs of dishonesty. For the first time, she noticed something genuine in him. It wasn't enough to undo the past, but it was a beginning. "We'll see," she said at last. "Actions are louder than words." In the following weeks, Edward honored his promise. He started dedicating more time to Rise Up, not as a donor, but as a volunteer. He joined meetings, helped arrange events, and took part in a fundraising drive. Gradually, he gained the trust of the staff and volunteers, though many still remained cautious about his motives. For Amara, observing Edward's change was both satisfying and confusing. She had thought he would quit after a few days, but he persevered. He was no longer the dismissive billionaire who belittled her work. He was genuinely attempting to understand a world previously invisible to him. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the food pantry, Edward spoke softly. "You were right," he admitted. "About everything. I've spent my life chasing meaningless things, thinking they'd bring me happiness. But they haven't." Amara paused, her hands freezing as she placed a can of soup in a bag. She turned to face him, her expression ambiguous. "What changed?" she inquired. "You did," Edward confessed. "You showed me a different way of life, a perspective I had never considered, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Amara didn't reply immediately. She had seen glimpses of this side of Edward before, but now it seemed genuine, unforced. Yet she couldn't ignore the circumstances that had brought them together, or that he still hadn't revealed the entire truth about the bet. "I'm pleased you're beginning to understand," she said finally. "But change requires time, and building trust takes even longer." Edward nodded in acknowledgement of her words. For the first time, he wasn't seeking a quick win or an easy path to success. He was prepared to wait, to prove himself, not just to Amara, but to the person he aspired to become. As they finished packing the last of the food bags, a silent understanding passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it love, not yet, but it was a movement forward. And for Edward, that was sufficient. The weeks after Edward's commitment to support Rise Up marked the beginning of an unexpected transformation. What initially seemed like a superficial attempt to impress Amara had evolved into something more meaningful, even if Edward didn't completely comprehend it yet. He became absorbed in the work, not just for the approval it might earn him, but because it felt authentic in a way his corporate empire never did. Each day at the community center brought new challenges and insights. Edward encountered single mothers balancing jobs and childcare, teenagers eager for a second chance, and elderly residents striving to preserve their dignity amidst financial struggles. Their stories were raw, unvarnished, and profoundly human. For the first time in years, Edward felt the weight of his privilege and the emptiness of the world he had created for himself. The change wasn't easy. Edward's presence at the center was met with skepticism by some and outright hostility by others. Many of the volunteers viewed him as an outsider, a wealthy man playing at philanthropy for personal gain. This sentiment was something Edward couldn't fully dispute. After all, his initial involvement was merely a strategic play in a game he no longer wanted to play. During a volunteer meeting one afternoon, Edward proposed an idea for broadening Rise Up's impact. Edward suggested enhancing the center's offerings by using his corporate network to secure additional funding and resources. The room grew quiet. Everyone turned their attention to Amara. With an unreadable expression, she stood up and addressed the group. "Edward's connections might help us reach a wider audience," she began cautiously. "But it's crucial that we stay true to our mission. Our focus isn't on impressing donors or chasing big numbers. It's about creating real change. And that begins by listening to the community." Her words struck a chord, but Edward acknowledged her point with a nod. He understood his tactics required a shift. This was not his arena, nor could he approach it like another business plan. Even with obstacles, Edward was determined. He dedicated significant hours at the center, assisting with everything from organizing events to scrubbing floors. Initially skeptical, the volunteers started to see another side of him. He didn't hesitate to get his hands dirty, and he was honest about not having all the answers. Amara noticed the shift too. Edward was no longer the aloof and detached man she had married out of obligation. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions instead of giving orders, and appeared truly committed to their mission. Still, a lingering feeling of unresolved issues between them remained. One evening, after a particularly taxing day at the center, Edward and Amara found themselves in the office. The volunteers had left, leaving the building quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Edward was poring over a pile of grant applications, his sleeves rolled up and tie loosened. Amara sat across, organizing donation records. "I've been reflecting," Edward said suddenly, cutting through the silence, "on how I've lived my life until now." Amara looked up, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" "I've spent so much time pursuing things that hold no true value," he confessed. "Money, power, status. I thought they would bring me happiness, but they haven't. Not really." Amara's gaze softened, though she didn't rush to respond. She had seen glimpses of this side of him before, but this felt different, genuinely heartfelt. "What do you want now?" she asked. Edward paused, then looked at her with a newfound clarity that surprised even himself. "I want to achieve something worthwhile. I want to become a person who truly makes a difference." Amara studied him intently for a moment, searching for any traces of insincerity. Eventually, she nodded. "Then commit to showing up, every single day. No matter how tough it gets, that's how trust is built." Taking her advice to heart, Edward became an indispensable part of the center's daily activities. He worked tirelessly, not for accolades, but to prove to Amara, to the volunteers, and to himself that he was open to transformation. Simultaneously, Edward began implementing changes within his corporate life. He started questioning the practices at Carter Enterprises, especially those prioritizing profit over people. He advocated for policies that supported fair wages, ethical sourcing, and community involvement. His board of directors resisted, but Edward remained determined. As Edward's transformation gained momentum, the high society circles took notice. Marcus Whitman, the man who presented the initial wager, invited Edward for a lunch to catch up. "Honestly," Marcus said, as they sat in a private dining room at a luxurious club, "you've really impressed me." Edward took a sip of his drink. "How so?" "I didn't expect you to last this long." Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" "This entire charity act," Marcus commented with a smirk. "It's impressive, but it's not you. You're a businessman, not a social worker." Edward's jaw clenched. "People can change, Marcus." "Perhaps," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. "But don't forget why you started this. A bet is a bet, remember." The reminder landed like a heavy blow for Edward. He had almost forgotten about the bet. Or rather, he had wanted to. His relationship with Amara, once merely a game, had evolved into something vastly more complex. And now, the burden of his deception loomed overhead like an impending storm. Returning to the penthouse that evening, Edward sat alone in the living room, sipping a glass of scotch. He pondered over Amara, her resilience, her steadfastness, how she had compelled him to face his own truth. And for the first time since everything began, he wondered if he had already lost. Edward realized that he could not continue deceiving Amara. To truly transform, he needed to confess. As Amara entered the room, drained from yet another long day, Edward rose to greet her. "Amara," he started, his voice shaky. "There's something I need to tell you." She gazed at him, her expression tired, yet patient. "What is it?" she asked. Edward paused, feeling the burden of his admission weigh heavily on him. He had spent his life avoiding being open, but now he had no other option. If he wanted to regain Amara's trust, he had to begin with honesty, regardless of the outcome. Edward stood in the shadowy living room, city lights filtering through the large windows behind him. The scotch in his hand quivered slightly as he faced Amara, who was still holding onto her purse. Her face was composed, but wary, her eyes narrowing slightly at his apparent discomfort. "I haven't been truthful with you," Edward began, his tone subdued but firm. "About my motivations for approaching you. About the reason I proposed marriage." Amara set her purse on the counter and crossed her arms. Her face remained unreadable, but the air felt thick with tension. "Please, continue," she said, her voice steady but strong. Edward inhaled deeply. "When I first suggested this arrangement, it wasn't due to interest in your work, nor was it because I truly believed in it." He released a breath, his jaw clenching. "It was a part of a bet." The words lingered like a heavy blade. Amara's body tensed, her arms dropping by her sides as she fixed her eyes on him. "A bet?" she repeated, her words laced with sharpness. "You married me over a bet?" Edward nodded, feeling the guilt wash over him like a tidal wave. "Yes, it started as a challenge. A game, if you will. Marcus Whitman dared me to marry someone outside of my world, to prove I could adapt and still succeed." The word succeed felt sour now. It had once been about control, about proving himself. Now, as he stood before Amara, it seemed empty. "And I was just a part of your game," Amara said, her voice softer but no less piercing. "A pawn on your board." "No," Edward replied quickly, moving closer. "Not anymore. I understand how it sounds, and I know I was wrong, so wrong. But everything changed. You changed me. It began as a bet, but now it's much more than that. I care about you, Amara. I care about what you've built, and I care about the people you're standing up for." Amara raised a hand, halting his words. "So when exactly did it stop being a game?" she inquired. "After the wedding? After realizing you couldn't control me? Or was it when you found out your wealth didn't matter to me?" Edward opened his mouth, but no words emerged. He had no response that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Amara shook her head, her voice growing louder. "Do you even realize what you've done? You didn't just lie, you used me. You turned something as meaningful as marriage, something I only agreed to for the sake of those I care about, into a stunt." "I understand," Edward said, his voice faltering. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to be honest. I couldn't keep lying to you." Amara glared at him for a long moment, her jaw clenched. "You think confessing now makes a difference?" she questioned, her voice icy. "It doesn't undo the fact that you manipulated my life, that you violated my trust." Her words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. Edward felt the weight of his actions in a way he never had before. He had always avoided taking responsibility for his wrongdoings, hiding behind his wealth and power. But now, there was no escape. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he murmured. "I'm not expecting your forgiveness," Edward spoke at last, his voice barely above a murmur. "But I felt you needed to know the truth. You deserve at least that." Amara released a tense breath, her head shaking. "The truth?" she echoed, frustration tainting her words. "The reality is, it was never about me. It was always about you, your ego, your need to prove something to yourself or your friends. And now, after shattering the trust we built, you think an apology will fix it." Edward felt his heart drop. He had hoped for a different reaction, though deep inside, he understood he was unworthy of it. "Amara, please!" "No," she cut him off, her voice resolute. "I don't want to hear it. I don't know if I can trust you again, Edward. Without trust, there's nothing." With those words, she turned away, moving toward the door, grabbing her bag as she left. Desperate, Edward trailed behind her. "Amara, wait," he pleaded. "Let me show you that I've changed." Stopping at the door, she faced him, determination etched in her face. "Change isn't enough, Edward," she replied. "Not when it sacrifices someone else's dignity." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Edward in the quiet solitude of the penthouse. He remained still for a long while, fixated on the door, as if willing her to return. But deep down, he knew she wouldn't. The days that ensued were the loneliest Edward had ever known. Without Amara, the penthouse felt vast and empty, its luxury irrelevant. He immersed himself in work, but found little comfort there, too. The projects that used to drive his ambitions now seemed trivial and hollow. At Rise Up, Amara pressed on with her work, unwavering in her resolve. She refused to let Edward's betrayal derail her mission. Yet, despite her focus on the community, the shadow of his confession lingered. She couldn't deny the sincerity in Edward's recent actions over the months, but their relationship had rested on a falsehood, and that was a wound slow to heal. Meanwhile, Edward embarked on a journey to atone for his actions. He donated millions to Rise Up, not to win Amara back, but because he believed in her cause. He also reassessed his business practices, adopting policies that prioritized ethics over profit. These changes garnered both praise and criticism from his peers. But Edward was indifferent. For the first time, he wasn't seeking their approval. Yet none of it seemed sufficient. Edward couldn't forget Amara's face as she left, the pain in her eyes as she grasped the depth of his deception. He longed to make amends, but didn't know how, or if it was possible. One evening, as Edward sat alone in his penthouse, his phone chimed with a notification. It was an email from a volunteer at Rise Up, expressing gratitude for his contributions and sharing a photograph of the new community center they were able to open with his help. The picture showed Amara standing before the building, surrounded by children and volunteers. She appeared weary but radiant, her smile wide and sincere. Edward gazed at the photo for a long time, a lump forming in his throat. He understood then that his journey wasn't about seeking Amara's forgiveness or winning her back. It was about becoming someone he could look at in the mirror with pride. If there was any hope of rebuilding what they had lost, it would have to start with him. Not his wealth, not his connections, but the person he aspired to be. And for the first time, Edward realized redemption wasn't a destination. It was a path. One he was finally prepared to travel. Months went by, each day marked by a quiet resolve on both sides. For Edward, life had transformed into a relentless pursuit of redemption. He no longer sought validation from his wealth or social stature. Instead, he found meaning in his actions, the efforts to repair the damage he had inflicted. His once pristine world of power and prestige now felt void, and the work he did with Rise Up became his mooring, a constant reminder that change was indeed possible, even for someone like him. Amara immersed herself in her work diligently. She had broadened Rise Up's offerings by inaugurating new neighborhood centers and initiating projects for job skills and affordable homes. Edward's generous contributions were helpful, yet she insisted to her team that their mission wouldn't rely on any single donor. Her determination was unwavering. However, at night, in the city's silence, her drifted to Edward, not the man who placed a wager on, but the one evolving, showing moments of humility, compassion, and even love. One cool fall evening, Amara stood on the steps of Rise Up's latest center, observing families entering for the grand opening event. The building symbolized years of dedication, a beacon in a previously neglected area. She welcomed volunteers and attendees, her smile genuine but laced with fatigue. Amidst the guests, she noticed a familiar presence. Edward stood near the door, in casual jeans and a sweater, unlike the tailored suits he once donned as protection. Nervously holding a small envelope, he searched the crowd. Their eyes locked, and for a second, all the noise seemed to disappear. Amara paused before approaching him, her heartbeat quickening. "Edward," she said, carefully but kindly, "why are you here?" He gave a hesitant smile. "I heard about the opening. I wanted to see it myself." She examined him, noticing subtle shifts in his behavior. He appeared more introspective and grounded, as if his time apart had stripped the arrogance he was once known for. "It's a significant evening," she indicated the lively center. "So many people came together to achieve this." "You should be proud," Edward said sincerely. "This is amazing, Amara." Her face softened, though she remained on guard. "Thank you," she replied. "But it's not just about me. It's about them. The community." "I know," Edward acknowledged. He extended the envelope. "I brought you this. It's a personal contribution, separate from the company's involvement. No commitments needed." Amara received the envelope, but didn't open it. She looked at him instead, her tone steady. "You didn't need to be here for this." "I didn't come solely for that," Edward confessed. "I wanted to see you." Amara's heart tightened, though she hid the feeling. "Why?" Edward ran a hand through his hair, showing rare vulnerability. "I needed to apologize," he admitted. "Again, not just for the bet, but for everything. For dismissing you, for my controlling nature, for failing to appreciate you from the beginning." Amara didn't respond instantly. They locked eyes as she searched for any insincerity. She found none. For the first time, his words appeared genuine, free from the smooth talk he used to depend on. "I can't trust you yet, Edward," she finally said, quietly. "Not now." "I understand," he replied, his voice firm. "I don't expect immediate forgiveness. I'm not here for that. I just wanted you to know I see you now. Truly. And I'm committed to proving I'm worthy." The evening continued, with Edward watching from the sidelines as Amara gracefully mingled with the guests. He didn't press her for more conversation, respecting her need for distance. As the event wrapped up, he left quietly, leaving her with the envelope and words he hoped showed his earnestness. That night at home, Amara opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, penned in Edward's neat, elegant handwriting. It was brief, but carried the weight of what he couldn't express in person. "Amara, I've spent much of my life building defenses, believing they made me strong. But you taught me that real strength comes from lowering those defenses. You've challenged me like no one else, and I'm grateful. I may never deserve your pardon, but I will strive to earn it, because you and your work have transformed me in unimaginable ways. Yours, Edward." Amara read the letter twice, emotions swirling. Anger, sadness, and something indescribable. She wasn't fully ready to forgive him. Not yet. For the first time, however, she wondered if a way forward existed. Over subsequent weeks, Edward continued his support for Rise Up discreetly, honoring Amara's boundaries while remaining devoted to the cause. Slowly, she recognized the depth of his change, not in grand gestures, but in the steady reliability of his deeds. One morning, as they volunteered together at a food drive, Amara spoke up. "You've changed, Edward." He looked at her, his face unreadable. "I had to." "I see that," she replied, her tone softening. "But change must be lasting." "It will," Edward assured. "This isn't just about you, Amara. It's about being someone I'm proud of. And finally, I feel I'm becoming that man." Amara nodded, a gentle smile appearing. "We'll see." Months later, they found themselves at another Rise Up event, this time as partners. Not in business, not in obligation, but in something undefined, something understood. Their journey was messy, painful, uncertain, yet it led to a place of mutual respect and understanding. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Edward turned to Amara. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked. "For giving me a chance to transform," he said. "For showing it's never too late to start anew." Amara smiled, warmth in her eyes reaching him at last. "Just don't waste this opportunity, Edward." "I won't," he promised. And now they stood, not as opponents or strangers, but as equals, ready to face what lay ahead, together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story and wish to see more, be sure to subscribe to the channel to catch our newest videos. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Explore our other stories for more engaging content. See you next time.